welcome everybody. We're happy to see so many people here tonight. I'm hoping, Gay, can you put your thumbs up? Can you hear me and you see my slide? Okay. Excellent. Okay. All right, so you have joined our event. We are the Genealogical Research Institute of Virginia. I'm going to have a few GRIVA announcements first before I turn things over to our speaker, David Gibbons. Consider joining. I'm not begging you to join. I'm not saying you have to join or anything like that, but I'm hoping that you will consider joining if you like our events. Most of our programs are free to attend, but your contribution helps us bring them to you. Plus, if you join, you receive our quarterly newsletter and you get discounts to any of our paid events or any products we may be selling, such as Gilmer maps. We have gotten our hands on a number of high quality prints of the Civil War maps covering parts of Virginia and North Carolina. If you're interested, you can click the Gilmer Maps tab on GRIVA's website, which is just griva.org. If you go there, there's a little tab at the top that says Gilmer Maps, and you can get information about what maps we have available. You can get an order form and find out how to order the maps. You can also see a recording of Cassandra Farrell's talk about the maps. Cassandra from the Library of Virginia did a nice program meeting for us and talked about the maps, and you can see a recording, and their link will be right there on that page. For some upcoming events, our next meeting of the German Special Interest Group features Günther Offner of the Familia Austria website. He's going to be talking about the Habsburg Empire. That is June 1st, and that is Tuesday. Now, we usually meet at 7. Note that this particular meeting is at 1 p.m. That's to accommodate him because he is speaking live from Vienna, Austria. So we're not going to make him stay up in the wee hours of his time just to accommodate our 7. So we are having a lunchtime-ish meeting at 1 p.m. I'm going to put these registration links in the chat box in just a few minutes. After that, we have the DNA Special Interest Group that meets the second Tuesday of most months at 7 p.m. It is online for now. The next meeting is June 8th, and I will be talking about Father's Day and why DNA. So you can register for that as well. We also have a GRIVA June luncheon online. And all of these events are free and open to the public. That's the June luncheon is Monday, June 14th at noon. And you can come and join us, bring your lunch to your computer and tell us about your favorite book or website or genealogical find or what you've been doing since the pandemic or what you intend to do now that things are easing up a little bit. Also, save the date. Our GRIVA Fall Conference will be Saturday, October 2nd. We're going to have Mark Lowe coming to talk to us about all kinds of things, Southern research and migration and that sort of thing. So that we're all looking forward to that. And now I'm going to introduce David Gibbons. He's going to be talking about recent discoveries at Jamestown, bringing the 400-year-old site into the 21st century. David Gibbons is Director of Archaeology from the Jamestown Rediscovery Project. And he's going to highlight recent finds of the high-profile individuals of the 1617 church at James Fort. As part of the ongoing forensic pursuits of the Rediscovery Project, Mr. Gibbons will discuss excavations, genomics, and identification methodologies that are bringing the 400-year-old site into the 21st century. David is a staff archaeologist with the Jamestown Rediscovery Project. He specializes in archaeological geographic information systems. His job involves the linking of volumes of spatial data and archaeological information into a viable and sustainable digital archive. He is also a principal author of the book Church and State, The Archaeology of the Foundations of Democracy. So with that, I welcome David. If you could please unmute yourself and I will stop sharing so you can start sharing.
All right. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for coming.
I think we have a pretty interesting show for you tonight. I will say, however, that I hope I am not mother-in-lawing or father-in-lawing you about some of this information, as you guys are experts in, potentially experts in genealogy and genomics, so you'll have to forgive me, but I will walk you through what we're up to at Jamestown with this excavation and some of the other pursuits that we have. And I'll caution that I am going to show human remains, and that can be upsetting to folks. So just be aware of that. And I always predicate my talks with that, so people have an opportunity to potentially turn away. Well, if you guys aren't familiar with Historic Jamestown, we are a nonprofit subsidiary of Preservation Virginia. The Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation has its own 501c3 nonprofit, and we have 22.5 acres of which we jointly manage with the National Park Service, Colonial National Historic Park, on Jamestown Island, a 1,500-acre island on the north side of the James River near Williamsburg. We have been excavating since 1994, and there is probably generations of archaeology to do as we study the fort to town to James City, our colonial capital, when it was removed to Middle Plantation in 1699. So our story begins, and I'm going to give you guys a very quick summary of the history that places us within the time period that we'll be talking about at Jamestown. But if you're not familiar, the colony was our nation's first corporation, founded and named the Virginia Company. It was a for-profit stock venture in that the assets were not to be liquidated upon return of some of the goods that were recovered in the New World. Now, they left London in December of 1606 and arrived in the James River basin. They were told to go 100 miles inland and not to suffer any naturals between their location and the ocean, because those people may be used against you. And they're referring to the Spanish. And we now know through, of course, archaeology and John Smith's map that there are no villages except for potentially Kicquetan, from our location, the James River, all the way to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Now that is, you may think about the Nansemons or Kicquetan, but those were down rivers or sort of hidden around corners. So they're following directions. They did go all the way to the fall line of the James River in Richmond, and that's where they encountered the village Powhatan. And then there are villages out on the river all the way down to Jamestown. So that's why they settled on the island. It's low-lying. They were using field pieces that were meant to be fired at nearly dead level. This man you know of, John Smith, he's the one who actually argued with a gentleman named Edward Moriah Wingfield about building a fort. So Wingfield was following company directions in which they said not to build a fort, and Smith argued openly in front of him with the men that they should build a fort. And of course, you know about John Smith and may have never heard of Edward Moriah Wingfield, but Edward Moriah was principal in designing then that fort that they built. The triangular fort covers 3 sides, water, 2 landward, and we don't need a fourth side, a fourth flanker, because of the pitch and tar swamp. Now, this is the only icon we have of James Fort, essentially. It was John Smith's map was copied by Pedro de Zuniga, and this map was found in the archives in Salamanca. And we've blown up that triangular fortification with the bulwarks and potential outworks. It's something we're exploring right now. The X marks the spot in the middle is actually a Maltese cross that is marking the location of the 1608 church there. And the flag is something that we may have found recently with ground penetrating radar. So stay tuned. That's my next GRIVA lecture. So we know in 1608, John Smith writes a letter to the company in which he says, please stop sending us people that don't do things. And so they the Virginia Company puts together a 9-ship flotilla. It's headed over in June of 1609 and runs into a hurricane, and half of the supplies and half of the colonists are shipwrecked on Bermuda. We now know that John Rolfe acquired tobacco seeds of Spanish tobacco on Bermuda, as well as Spanish hogs, Iberico hogs. And they brought both of those to Jamestown. And tobacco was our number one export from 1613 to 2005. Now, the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas ended the Anglo-Powhatan War, which had gone on from the Starving Time winter of 1609 and 10 to 1614. And once that war was over, the colonists were free to expand out into the town. And like I had said, it was our colonial capital until 1699, when it's removed off the island to Middle Plantation, which today is Colonial Williamsburg. Once that happens, the landscape, the town melts into the ground, essentially. And this is a picture from the water of our iconic church tower as it stood at the turn of the century, when our organization, Preservation Virginia, acquired 22.5 acres around the tower because human remains were eroding into the James River and people were concerned. And thus began our organization and archaeology. So one of the first things that is conducted is archaeology in 1897. A few years after they acquired the property in 1893, this woman married Jeffrey Galt and married Garrett Winder, and a Confederate stonemason, William Leal, began clearing away the trees and excavating the site that they believed was the location of the first General Assembly of Virginia, and therefore arguably the foundations of our modern democracy. And that church was subsequently wrapped by a brick church. So it was a timber frame church, which we know from records was 20 by 50 and constructed in 1617. Government was held in that building in July and August of 1619. And the brick portion was constructed in 1639 and then redone in 1647, or reconfigured. It was then portions were burned in Bacon's Rebellion, and we now know the tower was constructed between 1680 and 1690. And that's something we're working on right now, the forensics of that out in front of the tower. So with the anniversary of representative government in English North America in 1619, we began pursuits to go back and understand that building. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, not sure, there were human remains investigated, and so the effort was twofold. We know when you excavate human remains and expose them to air that they rapidly start to decay. And we know from the Preservation Virginia notes, Mary Garrett Winder and Mary Jeffrey Galt, that they did expose some. And in fact, you can see in this picture where the log is crossing the foundations, there's actually a grave exposed there just to the left of the shovel. But in all, pretty phenomenal work for that time period. And it is our nation's first woman conducting, actually directing archaeology. So although there's other women archaeologists, Mary Jeffrey Galt was the first to direct archaeology out there. And so fantastic for our side, our nation. A lot of firsts at Jamestown. But this is the structure that we decided to look at and go back, both the building to see if we could find the full location, which they had not done, understand the buildings in a forensic way, and look at the individuals who were dug into. So this is what the church looked like in 2016. Some of you may have come to visit. There were some confusing ideas that were set into there. There was glass windows in the floor that showed you the archaeology, and then multiple iterations of chancels in the far eastern end of the church. The chancel is the holiest part, I guess you could say, of the church, and usually in Protestant church takes up exactly 33 1/3 of the church. And that is asterism. So it's Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And I know this from crawling through many, many churches in England that the Victorians didn't get their hands on, which was pretty interesting police work in itself. So this is what it looked like before we tore up the floor and we pulled up the fabric, and much to our surprise, it was exceptionally intact. So in the back part of the chancel, you can see the trench that the APVA had excavated down into the human remains. There's a little bit of the center aisle of the church left, and then that brick wall that's cutting probably 7 degrees across the parallel lines of the church. We're looking to the east, is a cemetery wall constructed in 1803 by the Jacqueline Ambler family to enclose what they believe to be their full family cemetery out there. So pretty exciting that we would see something intact. And our first pursuit was to go after the building. And to that end, we were very successful. We found this is the foundations that they built in 1617. It was constructed under Samuel Argall's administration as governor or acting governor. And you'll see that there's tough clay, what they call tough clay, cobblestones, and then 2 levels of brick and mortar on top of that. And then there would have been a timber sill and a timber frame church. Now, we know what they're doing. They're trying to insulate their wood from the ground, because in Virginia it's very wet and damp. And there's one thing we have in the United States they don't have in England, and that's termites. And so the colonists complained very quickly within the first few years that their fort walls, for example, you could just walk up and kick them at the base and they would fall apart because of the termites. So this is adaptation and change, but this is essentially what the wall of the church was comprised of. And so we were hunting this out. We very quickly found the far eastern end. And again, this church was described as 20 by 50. And so that projected the other western end inside our brick tower. Now, I left that to the very last part for a couple reasons. One, for traffic flow. We had constructed decks inside the church, and you would go through the tower and into the church and walk around the archaeologies we conducted and look down on what we were doing. And so I didn't want to shut off the tower too early. I also felt that somebody must have dug inside the tower. I mean, that's the first place I would dig, is inside the only intact 17th century structure. And so in January of 2019, we set forth to looking for our far western wall. Now I'm kind of jumping forward in time a little bit, but I think this makes more sense in terms of the building. So the interior of the tower had modern and historic bricks that were cemented into a concrete floor. So we had about 8 inches of concrete brick and a drain. And it was very daunting for us. We found out that the brick floor and concrete floor were not even attached to the tower. There was a actual gap when the concrete shrunk. And so there was dirt in between that insulated us. So that was good because we didn't want to do anything to damage the tower. However, in trying to think how to look into the ground before we even did that, we decided to use ground penetrating radar. Now, this is something we've recently gotten exposed to working with the National Park Service. We've since bought 3 of these pieces of equipment, and it allows us to see right into the ground, and is absolutely phenomenal in the right hands, which we have gotten very good. I think we've volunteered in the last few years at over 60 sites around Virginia, helping people, our colleagues, and cemeteries and things like that, helping people. In fact, I'm headed to the Eastern Shore tomorrow morning to go image a 1680 church that's all the way up near the Maryland border. So we get, and that's my vacation, by the way. So that's going to, what we'll do is tomorrow we'll use this piece of equipment that one of my archaeologists, Bob Chartrand. It fires radio waves into the ground, and you run it in straight lines, and then you interpolate those, or you bring them all together and make a map, and this is what we saw. It was exactly 50 feet in the center of the tower, and we thought, there's no way, that can't be, it's too easy. And it was the case. We ended up excavating that and finding that exact pattern of brick on top of clay and cobblestones. The dark material may be native horizon, or we are kind of rethinking that as of the last few weeks. That might be the burning from Bacon's Rebellion of that church. And we do now believe that 10 feet of the wooden church stuck out of the brick church with a bell tower, and that's likely what was set on fire. It's pretty hard to set a brick church on fire. You can, but this makes a lot more sense given what it was comprised of. So we had our church on the interior, and as I said, 33 1/3 of a church is the chancel, and we found that. They referred to it as the choir, and that's just a medieval reference to a choir and chancel where that had a rood screen that restricted your view from that holy area. It was a carryover, but what we were interested in is that they said they took their oath and then went into the body of the church to conduct their government. That was important to us because then we could actually, when we went to reconstruct, you could sit in the exact location where the Burgesses sat in that hot day in July and August, hot days in July and August of 1619. So all of archaeology is envisioning what's above ground, right? It's the ultimate image is what did the church look like? And so, like I said, this is a forensic investigation. And so I love this picture. We're all standing around looking at the walls of the church that melted into the ground with, literally, you can see from our faces, we're wondering what the heck we're looking at. But very quickly, we figured out the differences between the timber frame and brick. Our timber frame from the evidence matched the governor's edition by Samuel Argall, the same man who ordered this church to be constructed. But it is the rarest form, even in England, of timber framing in which there's studs and main posts every 4 feet. And then they put slots in between the studs and slide lath down. So we had the imprint on the interior of lath and then a brown coat and a finish coat of plaster. And on the exterior, we had mud. And then as this gentleman you see in Kentucky is actually practicing that art, which is very rare, but you plaster over the mud on the exterior and you put these little dimple holes so the plaster doesn't fall off. And of course, in the picture, I'm holding that piece of out exterior rendering with the dimple holes. And we found this over and over again. And so clearly not what was attached to brick, clearly a timber frame building. When I was in graduate school in England, they said, you'll never see this. It's the rarest kind. And of course, that's what we found. Now, of course, archaeology is science, and what we do is take it to the nth degree with the plasters and mortars. So we're working with Dr. Paul Stutzman at the National Institutes of Standard and Technology to thin section and look at these. And in some, I'll tell you very quickly because it's a whole hour-long lecture in itself. But these renderings and plasters, Dr. Stutzman he said, I have not seen these since we looked at Roman materials. Now, for us, that's pretty phenomenal, right? A lot of people think Jamestown are a bunch of people running around in gunny sacks, dying next to a swamp. And in actuality, these guys are straight out of the guild systems in London. And so they're practicing an art that they have spent their entire lives working in, and it only makes sense. Now, interestingly, as we see the transition between enslaved labor in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s, that entire system changes, not only from timber framing, but to brick construction. So pretty interesting little something out of just a little piece of mortar, as it were. Now, the ultimate, like I said, is envisioning what this church looked like, and we have a digital history team that has modeled the church, and you can actually look at these in 3D and walk around the spaces, which is, of course, very important. And what we're trying to do is model the entire town as we go along. And that process is exceptionally rewarding, in that you're working with these modelers and telling them, no, that's not like that, or, oh, that looks perfect. So absolutely fun. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit. And at this point, I will show some human remains. But this is the sum, essentially, of the individuals that we looked at. It is more like a crime scene than anything else, and it's not as easy as you might understand. You can see that most of individuals have their head in the west, and one of the individuals has his head in the east, or is oriented with his head in the east. That's a common practice in the Protestant faith at this time. Folks were buried with their head in the west, so that in the second coming they would rise up and face, quote, the lightning of Christ, which would come from Jerusalem. And leaders and clergy would rise up and face the congregation. So that's something that we have seen repeatedly at Jamestown in the 1608 church and with other leaders, and something that's known quite a bit about in England. But it's rare that you would have the confluence of a holy area, high status leaders, and an early, essentially Tudor, post-medieval Tudor site like Jamestown. Now, we do work with the Smithsonian, and our work is exceptionally complicated. You see the team here with the Smithsonian and all these fragments. I will say that our notions of death and burial today are not shared by the colonists, and subsequent colonists over the centuries would bury people by digging right through other graves. And that makes our life exceptionally hard, in that we find people remains removed and in other graves. Some of the materials just scattered. It was exacerbated by the excavations of the turn of the century, where they dug people up and just kind of bundled them back into the ground. And so it's not always easy. And that's sort of the I guess what I wanted to convey. At times we do see an articulated individual. But most of the time, like this, there's some fragmentation in the church. Now, here is a picture of some of the graves we looked at, and I wanted to show you guys this because there are over 15 people buried in this 10-foot area. We can tell time both from which grave is cutting another grave. And so you see some of these graves are cutting each other. It's kind of like pickup sticks. But also look at the material in the graves. I think you guys can clearly see that there are multiple iterations of churches represented in the fill, and also multiple chancels over time that were cut through. And that's how we tell time. So you see the brick and mortar. Well, there wasn't a brick church there until after 1639. Ergo, if you're seeing quite a bit of brick and plaster that goes on brick and has the impression of brick behind it, then it's going to be much later than 1617. And so that's, and you can see here, they're actually cutting the 1617 footing. Most of the individuals that the APVA dug into, and unfortunately they sort of tunneled in sideways to some of these folks. Most of them post-dated the 17 church and were put in well after the English Civil War. So well after certainly the 1640s in this area. But there was one grave that became the sort of hot topic within the church, and it was underneath this rather strange pattern of herringbone brick. It was the widest grave we had seen in the church. There was some supposition by the archaeologists at the turn of the century that Sir George Yardley, the presiding governor of the First General Assembly in 1619, had been buried in the chancel of the 17 church. This, because we had found both ends of the church, we knew this was in the very center where the Burgesses took roll, and where it was described is that the governor had his usual seat. At the turn of the century, where the blue arrow is pointing, the archaeologists had found the oldest tombstone in English North America. This tombstone is made of Belgian black limestone and would have had brass inlays. Those inlays were robbed out, but we know from our work in England and crawling through those churches that these type and this style of stone dates from 1620 to 1640 maximum. That's a maximum 20-year span. Sir George Yardley died in 1627, in October of 1627. Is that right? October, November. He made his will out a month before he died. Anyways, you can see that somebody robbed these out. That's very common in the English Civil War. They robbed out the brasses and then melted them down for gun parts. There's a knight standing on a parquet floor. The wispy bit to the left of his head there, or right, depending on how you're looking at it, is a scroll with Latin on it, and then the shield above his head would have been the family crest. So unfortunately, we don't have those. We do have a Yardley family member buried down in Lynnhaven who, quote, wants his gravestone to be like his cousins or his great-grandfather at Jamestown, the broken tombstone. And this, of course, was broken, glued back together. We took it apart and conserved it because they used Portland cement, which is highly acidic. So we took that off and used a modern bonding agent. These are examples of ones that we found in England and Coddington, north of London, for example, but are very similar, and it gives you an idea. Again, 1620 to 40 for those tombstones. Now, when we found this grave, we knew it potentially could be Yardley. And I am a graduate of Leicester University in England. I went to graduate school there, and I met Dr. Turry King, who identified Richard III, the king in the car park. We became friends. I invited her to come over and see what we could do with our individuals, thinking that someday we may have the opportunity to submit a DNA signature to something like Ancestry.com, and then you can compare your data to that. So that was a sort of dream of mine, and working towards that. So we called up Turry, and Turry said, what you need to do is do not dig into it. And we usually do a preliminary excavation to determine orientation. As dirt surgeons, we like to start with the feet, which are exceptionally complicated and delicate. And then we work our way to the cranium, which is the other portion that's exceptionally complicated and takes most of the time. So knowing that's how we wanted to start, and knowing Turry said, take a belt and braces. If you don't know what that means, that's English for don't let your pants fall down. Braces are suspenders. So she was saying, don't let somebody come back and question your work if you contaminated the grave. And so we essentially built on what they had done with Richard III. So this is July of 2019. And we were wearing PPE before it was popular, I would say. We spent hours and hours suited up, wearing masks, and excavating inside a tent that I designed and we constructed in the church. Mind you, it's July in Virginia. I think it was 110 degrees outside, but we were taking it seriously. Here is a perspective of my senior staff archaeologist, Marianna Richardson, and take a look at the fill in this grave. So the center part is the collapse of the coffin, essentially. And you'll see that in the background, that is a native horizon or native village that's there before the church. The floor of the church is above that. And then look in the fill. There is absolutely no brick or plaster in this grave. And that's what got us excited. We knew that it had to be one of the first things to go in that church. In the very bottom, we would find the brick chancel fragments, the chancel floor fragments in the very, very bottom where they had dug through that newly constructed chancel, 10-year-old chancel floor when they buried this individual we think is Sir George Yardley. By the way, the hole, this very wide hole, is the exact same size as that tombstone. So this is all circumstantial evidence, and like a crime scene, we're moving to that. Now, I had introduced you guys to radar and how we used it, but we learned it from this guy right here. It's a company, the radar company is up in New Hampshire, and this young kid in the beard here, the dark beard and hat, is Peter Leech. And we used radar on the site of First Africans down in the town to image the landscape. And while we were eating lunch under one of the trees, Peter said, "Look, Dave, if you're ever 4 inches from a skeleton, I think we can image it using high frequency radar. And you can't tell me something like that and me not have you give you a call." So that's what I did. Peter came down and we used a 2700 megahertz antenna. This little guy here is for concrete inspection. And the other unit, if you're interested, was 350 megahertz. So this is very high frequency. High frequency is higher resolution, but less penetration, so you can't go as deep. So here we are running lines in the church, and this is what we saw. So this is the first time in the history of archaeology and using radio waves or imaging that we could actually and did image a skeleton. So you guys, I think you can see sort of the spine, shoulders, hips, femurs. The lower tibia are interesting. They're sort of redacted from the image, and I'll ruin the surprise and show you what we found. It's pretty phenomenal. It's near an exact copy, and I'll go back so that you guys can see that. Hopefully it'll go backwards. Yep. But that's pretty crazy to be able to do that in our field without contaminating. That opens up a bunch of opportunities to not even expose remains and yet image and get stature and other information from a grave, again, without contaminating. So a couple things I want to show you guys about forensically that I'm seeing, what I see in the field. First of all, this individual is wrapped in a shroud. He's bound, his knees are together. So after the lecture, if you stand up, most females' knees will touch and most males do not. And so when the knees are together, the feet are tightly sort of wrapped together like that. This individual is bound. His hands are down below his hips, and we would eventually find pins that showed or suggested that he was laid out in state. So this individual was laid out in state with his hands down by his side. Now, one of his hands is slipped under his hip, and the left femur is rotated, torqued around. And that caused that's your left upper leg, and the lower tibia there is rotated around. And so why we were getting redacted information from the radar is because your tibia is triangular, and we are essentially, it was acting like a stealth fighter, and the radio waves were being sent off in different directions and not returning to the unit. So really interesting for physics. Now, these images are actually pixel depth mapping. We use a DSLR to create a model of the remains that we look at. So these aren't the actual real things, it's a model. And the upper one, the green, is a high spot. And so that's why the hand slid under and the body, the left femur, torqued, because the coffin was canted. So if you look at the lower portion, you see that the two femurs followed the slope of the burial shaft, indicating that we had correctly dug to the bottom. It wasn't us. It was actually, they didn't dig the center of the shaft all the way flat. And then the upper portions there with the radar signature are what bones look like, with the what's called a parabolic signature. In the lower image, we use the computer to what's called migration. So we migrate it down to the single location. That's how you see the remains so clearly. Now, this is our excavation tent. Like I said, I custom designed this using a program called SketchUp. The idea was you can't have a clean room in a dirty archaeology site, right, guys? Like a lot of people wanted to call it a clean room, and I said, well, no, it's actually keeping DNA out. And the way that we did that is we pumped cold air in the upper right hand portion. You can see pipes coming in, and there was an air conditioner, an industrial air conditioner with HEPA filters pumping cold air in. So it was about 64 to 68 degrees on the inside, despite 100+ temperatures on the exterior. We had a window in which people could take notes, and we could talk to them. That's our staff photographer in the upper end. And then 2 staff members laid on the boards for shifts, and we dug in 2 17-hour days. So Saturday and Sunday, 17-hour days. The Smithsonian was there on Monday. They did their forensic work into Tuesday, and then Wednesday we transported remains to the FBI labs at Quantico, where Dr. King and another agent extracted DNA, and then they ran the DNA sequencing at Quantico in their labs, and another sequencing was done at the Max Planck lab in Germany. So 2 different continents, 2 different labs. I will say that our belt and bracing worked out, because even this picture you see here, we're inspecting the remains inside. We had 0 contamination at both labs, which is unheard of. And in the end, we would recover 40% of this individual's endogenous DNA from this individual in an ancient DNA environment. That's sort of unheard of. So we did very well. It's both our work and then the conditions, I think, within the church. Now, you may have heard of this, but our individual was missing his cranium, and you may have seen that. That cranium was found in the adjacent grave just to the south, or excuse me, the east of this individual, south and east. And what they had done is excavated into that grave in a later time period, and the excavator had gently laid the mandible and cranium into the upper fill at the very end of the filling of that grave. And so we were able to match that up using the teeth. And that's what the other slides were. Now, when we're testing ancient DNA, you can test any bone, but the best bone to go for is the petraeus bone, and it's right behind your ear. It's in the temporal area, and it's the hardest bone in your body, and it accretes over time like a tree growing, like tree rings. I don't know if you guys know this, but your bones are constantly remodeling. Every bone in your body, except for your teeth and the petraeus bone, builds. It doesn't remodel. And so when we look at where an individual is from using isotopes like carbon, New World grasses and grains have a different carbon signature. We look at not only a bone like the petraeus or the teeth, but we look at ribs and femurs that model at different rates, so we can actually tell how long you've been in Virginia using chemistry. It's pretty interesting, but we can tell if you're a Virginia Indian versus an Englishman. And in fact, an historian told me that this individual was Lord Delaware, and the isotopic signature absolutely refutes that, because this individual has been eating corn. He's been in the New World, and Lord Delaware hadn't been in Virginia since 1610, and on his way over to Virginia died at sea and was buried somewhere at Jamestown. Now, another thing is that this individual had corn and squash pollen and phytoliths in his lower gut, and that's something else that we test, but all forensic evidence of how we identify these individuals. Now, right before COVID, so this was in February, we traveled up to a micro CT lab in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and we were looking at the oral microbiome and health of this individual. So this tooth was exceptionally rotted, and there was some supposition that this may have killed him. That wasn't the case. The technician is pointing to the calcification around that infection, but it was quite severe. The individual here is Dr. Doug Owsley and our president, Dr. Jim Horn. And in the foreground, you can see the fibula is broken. That's and swollen. That should only be about as big as my pinky, and it's swollen bigger than my thumb there. And that's an osteomyeloma. That's a bone infection, which was manifested both in the fibula and the collarbone. So this individual's got something exceptionally wrong. The surgeons at University of Pennsylvania, where we then went the next day. Both oral surgeons and orthopedic surgeons said this individual would be in pain 24 hours a day. Aching pain, like having to walk with a cane, is what the surgeon said. Now, this oral surgeon here is looking at the coronoid process. It's the highest point of the mandible there. That's twice the size it should be. And that happens for two reasons. That can, in a modern way, that can be from clenching your jaw. You've probably seen people clench their jaw a lot, or night grinding. If you're grinding your teeth at night, your coronoid process will extend. It's flattened and extended up into your cranium. And in this case, we did not see on the occlusal surface of the teeth, the mating surface is grinding. And we think the pain he was suffering caused this elongation. So that's something we're still exploring, but with COVID, it's been tough. Here's a normal mandible in the lower portion, and our individual on the upper side with the nearly twice as long, or maybe more, of that coronoid process. So you can, usually it's straight across to the teeth, and you can kind of see the remnants of the original in the X-ray there. Now we also look at Yardley was a knight and rode around on a horse with armor. He's got quite a bit of damage consistent his spine, arthritic lipping on his spine from that type of activity, riding horses, and potential Puryear's facets is something we'll be looking at the femoral balls. And these are known cases with the Smithsonian where you might have a cavalry, somebody riding a horse. Those are known things. So we're interested in getting back into the Smithsonian, which is still shut down. So, who is this individual and how do we figure that out? Of course, I talked to you about genomics. Everybody and their mother knows about genomics these days with Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and all that. And this is a little bit different. We're going for a full sequence of this individual. At the time, several years ago, it was about $5,000, and now it's under $1,000. So the technology has come down. But here's the full sequence of our guy, and they've taken it even further because they do short tandem repeat testing of the Petraeus fragments, and so we filled much of this out. So now we know his hair color, his eye color, whether he had gout or not. Those are things that we can test when you've got 40% endogenous and good sampling and repeated sampling. So Turi lent me this slide, and this is the part where I don't want to mother-in-law you or father-in-law you, if you want to say that. But this is Richard III's family tree, truncated, but it's down through the Beaufort line on the Y chromosomal side. Richard had no children, and as you see that he potentially, even though with no children, he could have 1 to 17 million relatives alive today. So, of course, what we absolutely want is an unbroken Y chromosomal or mitochondrial line, the female line. And so with Richard, since he had no children, what we do is we go back up the line and down. In 2 areas, they were able to do that. But in his case, there was a paternity issue. In England, they call it being born on the other side of the sheets. I think in the United States, we say the milkman. But this provides for some interesting interviews with modern people, I would say. If you guys are interested in what we're doing a little bit more, check out Turi King's Queen's lecture in Berlin, I believe, where she points out that on the Beaufort line, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are related. That's how many people are out there on that line. But it was broken, and so they ended up going down the female line to Wendy Duldig and Michael Ibsen, who was a last Y chromosomal on the mito line. So that's where we are with our research. We have 26 potential folks, and you see on the very bottom here, Richard Hine died in Virginia, Tappahannock actually. The problem is, right when we were doing this research, COVID broke out, and you still can't go to any libraries or get any information. So you guys know, as genealogists, the frustrations with getting that done. And I can tell you that if you are a good genealogist, you are worth your weight in gold. And I'm not kidding. If I had to do life over again, I might choose that career path because really good genealogists on the other side of the pond are exceptionally hard to find. Now, we always do community outreach, and typically that's sort of seen as with African American or Virginia Indian families. In our case, we called the Yardley family out through the Jamestown Society, and they donated their DNA that day at Jamestown, and we did as well. But we, as of yet, we have not found a direct descendant, and we're exceptionally excited but patient with Turi and the team over there. We're going to try another method, and it's simply because we have such good recovery. We're going to look at jumping across the line. So we're working on a letter that we're going to send out to Yardley family members. So if they've already got their DNA sequence through Ancestry or 23andMe, we will ask permission to see that, and then they're going to try some new method that has worked for a case that's, I think, was 180 years old. But we were cautioned not to get our hopes up because this would be the oldest case in which they could jump across the lines and look at individual sequences and unique characteristics by that trait. Now I'll wrap it up a little bit here with that we do facial approximation with a lot of our high profile cases. Jane, the woman who was cannibalized, Bartholomew Gosnold, one of the founding members of the fort there, and Richard Mutton, a young boy who was killed by the Indians. It tends to humanize our process, and the FBI has graciously done an initial approximation of our individual. So you may be looking at Sir George Yardley's face there. The cranium is black. That's just the ink that they chose to use. Now, I will say that our forensic examination went to the outside of the church. There was a door that was added when they expanded the church, the brick church in 1639. That ended up being what we think is a portico. You see here in this picture, and we found a nearly matching church in England to our church that had a very similar door on the southeast and Norfolk area, 1624. So pretty interesting brickwork there. But in the case of Jamestown, it's usually 10 to 20 years before architecture catches up in the New World. We're always sort of behind at Jamestown. We also looked at a transitional period. They three-quarters enclosed the church and then finished it off in 1647. So we looked at that joinery in our forensic examination, and that's gone a long way to clear up the very sort of gray history about that. We continue to use the radar. This is Peter Leech. We invited him back down to help us with excavations in the 1608 church, and this may be Lord Delaware's remains. It's a forensic case that we're working on as we speak. But this individual was excavated out. He was exhumed sometime shortly after he was buried in there. So very interesting case, and you'll just have to stay tuned. Just like me, we're waiting on stuff. We are looking towards education with children. Everything we do is STEM based. And so I'm looking at putting together a book so kids can understand what we do. During COVID, I put together a book called Church and State that explains the forensics and everything, how we know what we know at Jamestown through the evidence of the buildings, the people, and actually us and who we are. And I wanted you guys to know it's not just me, it's an entire team that does the work. And we do have a fantastic team. I've recently taken over from Dr. Kelso, and of course, that torch has been passed on, and we continue the work onwards and upwards with the way that we were taught to excavate, certainly. We, like I said, there's generations of archaeology to be done at Jamestown. The fort's 1.5 acres, and the city is about 40 to 60 acres, depending on how you see it. So lots to do, and I have a lot to come back and talk to you guys about sometime in the future. So that is the end of the lecture. I think I ran over a little bit, but I think I gave you guys the full amount there.
Oh,
Thank you, Dr. Dave. Thank
I don't-
you.
I don't think anybody is complaining. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I have a slight question. The individuals you found in the church, have you been able to identify any of the ones that weren't important, or is this excavation ongoing?
Yeah, they're
Completely.
all, Lisa, they're all important. In fact, every time period's important. One of my employees just found a flash bulb and wanted to know if she should throw it away. And I said, no, in 1957, they took pictures of the Queen. And
I have maybe people, I'm adopted, like I had mentioned earlier. My folks that I know of, they ended up here sometime in the 1600s. I'm descended from Roland Taylor, the martyr. And we think one of his kids came over early, but we're not sure when or where. So I've been researching this.
Yeah. So should I take, would you like me to answer the questions in the chat box?
Yeah, I was going to read them to you actually, if you'd like,
Go
or
ahead.
if you'd rather, that's fine too. But I thought I'd give you.
It'd probably be easier if you read them.
Okay. Any DNA results for JR? Could he be Henry Payne, gentleman shot at Bermuda 1610? Would they leave a man of the Earl of Southampton on the beach?
JR was recently sequenced by David Reich's lab at Harvard. It is not Henry Payne, gentleman shot at Bermuda. And in fact, we think it's probably that burial is closer to Bacon's Rebellion, a third quarter burial. I hesitate to talk too much because the Smithsonian has done some phenomenal work on that grave, and I think they recently announced that work at a conference. But I will say this: that DNA tends to tear up your preconceived notions of who you think you dug up. For me, that's amazing, right? Like, it's the pursuit of science, and I love when we're wrong. I love it. And it's not an ego thing. It's just that, we're trying to push the limits of something that not a lot of people get to do on historic sites in America. And I just think it's great. It's police work, it's forensics, and sometimes you are wrong. Now, of course, we're searching down, and part of the process is exclusion. So is it Reverend Buck? Well, we dug the Buck site up on Neck of Land, and we don't think so. Buck was a exceptionally conservative individual and Puritan, and so in the New World, Puritans generally bury on their property. That's a very unique thing in North America, not in England. And so, anyways, exclusion is great. And I am hoping that, again, at some point, we will have all of these individuals up online and you'll be able to compare your DNA to them. But he is not Henry Payne. I can tell you that.
The next one, concerning the John White house about 1640. John White appears to be a person of substance, a successful merchant and burgess. Do we know his origins in England? Are there known descendants?
There are. I don't know that much about White. Unfortunately, there's thousands of folks that come through Virginia, and I get asked all the time, do you know, we dug up who we think is the White. Well, we think it's the White Warehouse, and we're sort of dealing with that now. We've gone back to that area, but we're also finding that quite a bit of the shoreline was washed away, maybe several hundred feet, and we found two buildings now that are south of the building that we thought was the White Warehouse. So that's all something that, as we piece that landscape back together like a puzzle, I think we'll have a better vision. But yes, that's an area we're currently excavating south of the White Warehouse.
I also got a question. How much does the ground penetrating radar cost?
Well, the units are vary. The one that looked like a little lawnmower that we used in the tower is about 17,000. The high frequency device is a little bit more, about 23, and we've recently purchased the sort of pro model, which they call the Sur 4000, and that one was about 38,000. All of those were funded by donors who, actually a donor who I went and ate dinner, lunch with at the Cosmos Club, and he looked me in the eye and said, "Dave, tell me what you need, not what you want." And I explained to him about radar and how that could change the future of our excavations at Jamestown, which it absolutely has. And so they made that happen. And that's, if you guys don't know, Jamestown, the real site, we get zero state or federal funding. The birthplace of America gets zero state or federal funding. The only consistent funding we've had over the years is from James City County, which we love. And the people who visit, right? You pay the money at the gate and you're paying for the excavations of our birthplace.
I shared the website of the historic Jamestown in the chat box, so I encourage everybody to go visit and explore.
Absolutely.
And he said Dr. Owsley has submitted a femur bone from a 1686 Virginia burial to the David Reich Lab at Harvard University for extraction of DNA. So that's exciting. Are there individual or group opportunities to participate in the work or research?
Yes, we have volunteers that come out, they're docents, and they answer questions of the public when we're working. That's a opportunity. Also, we have a summer field institute, not this year, because the students stay at William and Mary, but my oldest student was 70 years old. He was a retired airline pilot, and my youngest was 18. So we get the full range of people. All you got to do is be able to survive 6 weeks in the May to June weather, which is quite impressive. And as you may have noticed lately, if you're in this area, but yeah, I mean, it's day 2, you're out excavating with us. Day 1 is touring the site and talking about, housekeeping and what to wear and, bring water and all that stuff. And then we're out digging right away. Pretty phenomenal. And it's so if it's an opportunity you always wanted to dig, you can, I think in January we'll put up the field school application process.
Can I ask a question, please? What is the architectural styles that you found in the church relatable to buildings that you've seen in England?
Well, most churches of our time, the time period, the early 17th century, are timber frame. They really don't start brick construction in the New World till the 1620s. And that's at Jamestown, that's permanency in the town. They're trying to build a permanent town there. Before that, the first houses are called mud and stud cottages, and they represent a specific style of architecture from the East Midlands, specifically Lincolnshire, where we found them. They have mud walls, and the roof would have had about 9.5 tons of thatch. And so the mud, the clay in our area is almost like adobe when it's applied to the walls, and then it'll hold up quite a bit of weight. Our problem in our reconstructions, or I guess our interpretations on site, is they pargeted what they said they pargeted their buildings. We have not done that, and what that is burned oyster shell and some kind of animal fat. You can use hide glue, but Jimmy Price of Virginia Lime Works told me that if you boil rabbit skin or deer hide and then use the liquid with the burned oyster shell, that it'll make a nice gluey, essentially oil paint texture that's white. And so the buildings would have been bright white, interestingly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Got a question that you later answered, but was the DNA recovered mitochondrial or nuclear DNA? And you said you did a full sequence.
Yes.
Right. Of everything that you could get, I'm sure.
Yeah, like I said, it's exceptionally expensive. I think the FBI works with, of course, they don't charge money. They agree to work with you for a reason. And the reason that the FBI is working with us is because our cases are exceptionally hard. They're very, very hard. The division head at the Question Documents Lab told me that he wants to be able to sequence a fingerprint on a pipe bomb. And so some of our individuals are just absolute, just flakes of bone. You just don't see much there. It's something that we're concerned about because that information is just melting into history. And so that's something that will be taken on over the next few years is the actually the 1607 burial ground that we have found, the first colonists.
Did you find any graves outside of the church?
Yes, they're all over the place. There's hundreds and hundreds of individuals buried outside there.
I want to work through the questions in the chat box, if you don't mind, because there are a lot of them that were asked earlier. One question is the church and state book available now?
Yes, it's available online and in our gift store if you come to visit. It's my largest. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, it's my largest book yet. My first one was Jane, which was cannibalism, and it's very thin. Right, so I get more confident of my writing skills. All these books are done in this room at my house. This one especially during COVID. But this is church. The one that it was before Church and State. It's Holy Ground, and it's about the '08 church and the burials. A lot of science. So what I do is I write in a linear fashion from the beginning of the archaeology to the end, and then I dip down into history and science. But it's fuller, maybe a fuller version of the lecture, and then a lot of the pictures. It's very artsy. I was taught this program when I first, or I taught myself actually, and I lay out the books. And it's sort of a slide talk, but we find cool things like this 1897 dime that was found in the excavations from 1897 to 1901. So it's a really neat thing to understand how we do what we do. And I like to break down the barriers because people think that I guess we're in an ivory tower or something with our work, and it's not that at all. It's just hard work. I mean, I always tell people on site, you'd understand a 1957 Chevy from a Chevy today, right? People say, well, yeah, well, that's artifacts, right? Those are things that function and form and whatever changed over time. And some people are, they know every motor that was in a Chevy over the years. And that's our job, right? We know and can see when things are different or have changed. So yeah, anyways, yes, you can pick up all the books except for Jane. I'm actually coming up to Richmond to Carter Printing on Friday to approve the proofs for the third printing of that book. And how they're done is the donor funds the book, pays for it to be produced at Carter Printing, and then the sales go directly back to the archaeology. So I know Jane's gone through this will be our over 10,000 copies, and it's pretty good for the project.
Great. College level archaeology training must be changing dramatically with the new radar technology and advances in DNA analysis.
Yeah, I taught at William & Mary. I had 3 PhD students, and I was absolutely floored at how little they're teaching people these days how to do stuff. Not to quote John Smith, but it's hard to find somebody who knows how to survey, use a transit, how to get information into a computer to model it and things like that. We take those, I think, as common sense at Jamestown, but yeah, I mean, things and times change. I grew up in Blacksburg, and how I got into archaeology is I went to my history teacher, Miss Grapsis, and I said, look, I found this arrowhead on our farm. Who made it? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, where did the people go? And she said, I don't know. And I kept asking questions. And finally she said, look, kid, there's these archaeologists that meet at the public library. Go talk to them. And so I tend to hire people that ask why. They don't stop asking why and don't accept no for an answer and are willing to try any technology. And that's what Jamestown is. It's a Bell Labs of historical archaeology.
Cool. My family church is in Southampton County, Virginia, about 1838 persons UMC. My ancestors came over in the 1600s. Any advice on where I can find any additional info from England and research from 1600s and earlier?
Yeah, I mean, the foremost scholarship on early Jamestown is Martha McCartney, who's a good friend of mine. She's a phenomenal researcher and writer. She's got several books about the colonists. If you think you're a potential Jamestown Society member, I would connect up with them. It sounds like your group does quite a bit of genealogical research on that, so you can band together and then sort of go up to the next level. There's always somebody who's, better and better out there, and somehow, as you start working through this, which is such a fun thing, I totally get. I started researching the genealogy of Yardley, and I was in this office, and I started around 7 o'clock, and the next thing I know, it was 4 a.m, and I'm like, I didn't even notice. It's a rabbit hole, and it is so fun. But you will find people as you go along that can help you out, and I would start with the sort of basics with the books that Martha's produced. Unfortunately, the Rockefeller Library, I don't know if SWEM's open at William and Mary, but those are also places that you might be able to go to. Hope that helps.
Next question is, did your team use the ground penetrating radar to assist in uncovering Harriet Tubman's father's home?
No, not Harriet Tubman's. We did find the First Baptist Church at Colonial Williamsburg. We went over and helped them. It's something like I said, we've been volunteering to do. We just got back Thursday and Friday. We were at Bowling Green Plantation, the old mansion there. And like I said, I'm headed out to the Eastern Shore with the Department of Historic Resources tomorrow to go out and have a relaxing day and image a 1680s church, which is, it's really cool when you find these things. But yeah. Yep, nope, didn't help with Harriet Tubman's father's home, but we would be happy to.
The next question is for us, and I'm just going to answer it quickly. I'm new to GRIVA events. Were they via Zoom before COVID or in person? We typically have done events in person. Will they continue on Zoom in the future? We are talking about that. Whether every event is Zoom, we don't know for sure, but there will certainly be some Zoom things in the future from us.
Yeah, super powerful. I mean, I didn't quite know what to think when we first started, but now
we love being able to reach people outside of the area where people could drive to us. So
yeah.
Thank you so much. Quite interesting. We visited Jamestown several years ago when excavation of the altar had already started.
Nice. I like this one from Mary Seamster. Do you have any Givens ancestors in Virginia? Yes, that's what they just. Margaret Gunn and Ken Levine, we went over to dinner, and they said, have you ever thought about joining the society or look at your genealogy? And then I said, well, you can have we have a big Givens book. And I got an email the next day that he thought I was related to Nicholas Martineau down in Yorktown. So I would be honored, but I never thought, we're Scotch Irish from the Valley, and so I never thought that we would sort of be maybe First Family of Virginia or the Jamestown Society. I know we're DAR representatives through Daniel Givens who fought in the Rev War, but super cool. I mean, I just don't, I'm kind of honored because I think my family never thought about that. And my family is exceptionally into genealogy. The book's probably 2.5 inches thick, the Givens book. but yeah, of course, a lot of times the older you get, the more you want to know about your family history. It becomes a passion. So my contact information, I've seen that a couple times, is just dgivens at APVA. So it's Alpha Papa Victor Alpha.org. And
Did I get that right?
yes, that is perfect.
Okay, good. I've also shared the website, historic Jamestown with an E.org. And I think if you prowl around through that enough, there's a list of contacts with the organization, and you are one of many.
Yes, and we're doing, in COVID, I had my team doing research on documents before we start the project, which is not something we always have time to do. And so I started a YouTube channel called Dig Deeper, and I have the team filming what they're working on and then posting it up online. And so the Dig Deeper series is really fun because it's not always just archaeology; it can be other things. And we'll continue to do those. I think we're up to 30 some, maybe 35. And they've been exceptionally popular. People are coming out now asking for us by name, asking for my employees by name, because they recognize them from the videos. But yeah, really, really easy for us to produce, and then easy for folks to consume. I think they're quick. I think our most recent one was 12 minutes, but I was so proud of the team because now it's becoming almost like a TV show. They're getting so good at it. And you can see the evolution from when we first started, sort of how nervous we were. But
you've gotten lots and lots of thank yous in the comments.
I saw that. I always
lots and lots of them. I didn't read them all individually, but just to keep things from lasting all night.
Yeah, I always know when I do a good talk based on how many questions get asked. If I did well, then people ask a ton of questions. The last one there is, why does Virginia not support our work? The state of Virginia doesn't necessarily directly support nonprofits in the assembly in the budget. And we are a private nonprofit. So there are other ways that we're working on. We've got sea level rise issues, climate change. And so the work that we did with the Park Service on the First Africans was a civil rights initiative grant, where we worked out in the town for 3 years. And that was very amazing work. But I think, I really like how our visitors are paying for the archaeology. It's an honor for that to happen. And I think we love our jobs. We work long hours because we're passionate about this place. So, all right.
More thank yous and more thank yous, and everybody's looking forward to having you come back. So
I will come back anytime, and we can switch up the topics. Anything you guys like, we can talk about cannibalism. We can talk.
There's a crowd pleaser.
Yes, it's what everybody wants to see. We've got the first burial ground. We're continuing to work on the church tower. So this is one of the favorite parts of my job, is being able to articulate what the narrative, the stories we're finding, and the things, and it's very easy for me to do. So anytime that you would like to have me back, I am happy to do so.
Excellent. Thank you. Getting lots of thumbs up and clapping for that.
Good.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your expertise and your talk and hanging out with us. And thank you everyone for coming and attending and hanging out with us. And we did record this conversation, and we'll share the link with the GRIVA mailing list, and I will post it on our GRIVA Facebook page as well. It should be ready sometime tomorrow.
Excellent.
So,
okay. Well,
thank you, everyone.
Have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.